Joan Robinson, who's a renowned 20th century economist, said that we should all study economics so that we know when economists are lying to us. And I think there's two errors that are common in what we hear on TV or from agribusiness economists. And one is a reductionist thinking, to think that we can just focus on one little thing when in fact it's only part of a very big complex problem or a big complex system. Another thing is we are fed the idea of a black box economy. So we're not supposed to look inside the economy and decide what's good or bad or what's wrong or anything like that. We're just supposed to listen to the economists to tell us that there are certain things that we need to know, like gross domestic product, unemployment rates, things like that. And then, well, what are you going to do about that? That's got to be in the hands of other economists who think that that's important. And of course, corporate earnings is another one of those black box type things. We're not supposed to look at how they got those earnings. And I think, if you'll think about it, a lot of the problems we face in our society and around the world are the result of disparity. I think you can characterize our country by its disparity, whether it's wealth, income, communications, our political influence. And so I'd ask you, if we don't want a society and an economy characterized by disparity, well, what do we want? We want a society and an economy characterized by parity. We want a parity economy. I bet a lot of you have been accused of being socialist or communist if you proposed any real change in this. Well, forget all that. What we want is a parity economy. We need to concentrate on the operational answers that everyone can understand, that are necessary, because we want to have a parity society. Otherwise, we'll have disparity. And so let me give you an example. We talk a lot about living wages. And people have been talking about $15 an hour now for I don't know how many years. Well, let's say it was 5 years. If $15 was a living wage 5 years ago, it's no longer a living wage. We've had inflation since then. So there have been a change in the people's standard of living, in their quality of life in those 5 years in a negative way because of disparity, because of the effects of inflation, and we didn't think that that was important. So all the negative things that happened in their lives, we think, I guess, that they're not really important. It's okay if those families experience hardships, they can't take care of their kids, they don't know where their food's coming from, everybody in the family is working out of the home. Those are real costs to our society, but evidently we don't recognize it and we don't seem to have a way of dealing with that. Well, we got to recognize that the minimum wage, that's a living wage, has to be indexed to inflation. So if we've had 10% inflation over those 5 years, well, then the living wage today would be $16.50. And that's the principle of parity. We have to have operational definitions that guide our policy so that in the end, those costs to our society, whether it's people that work for a living or whether it's farmers, are actually taken into account, and we change the system enough so that we don't experience those costs. And before I talk about the parity principle as it is applied to agriculture, let's look at our food and agricultural system. Right now, there are between 40 and 50,000 items sold in a grocery store, and that's 40,000 more than was common 20 years ago. And I ask you, did you as a consumer want all that many items? No. I mean, I go through a store and I go, who the hell would buy that? You know? But I guess you got to have everything under the sun because there might be somebody that would want that, or it might be able to change people's thinking about what's good and what's bad, and they'll spend their money on something that they never even thought about before. And so I ask you, who are the real consumers? Are they us? Or are they corporations that take the raw materials from our farm and manufacture foods? So when Tyson and Smithfield and JBS buy corn and soybeans, aren't they the real consumers? They're just the beginning of an extraction process of raw materials for an industrialized food system, a food manufacturing system. It's just really, when you go to a CAFO, that's just and the feed truck comes up, that's really just the procurement step of raw materials and a manufacturing process. So should we even consider CAFOs part of agriculture? No, I don't think so. They have, those companies take no responsibility for the land or no responsibility for soil health or for our rural communities. Obviously, if you live out where I live and know the towns of Sheridan or Peyton or Grand Junction or Scranton, is a picture of the rainforest burning in Brazil for more agricultural production, and much of it eventually for corn and soybeans, that will drive the price of corn and soybeans even lower for farmers in Iowa and make them closer to bankruptcy. Now, and those corn and soybeans are part of the big global supply that feeds CAFO animals all over the world. So the more we have of corn and soybeans, the more CAFOs we have. That shouldn't be hard to understand. But and could this possibly make sense to anybody, to see the rainforest being burned to produce more corn and soybeans? Well, evidently it does to the Farm Bureau and the commodity groups and a bunch of agricultural economists. It surely makes sense to Cargill and Tyson and JBS. Now, the ag economist from the University of Illinois, and he's telling about next year's prospects for over 4 billion bushels of corn, 15 billion bushels of 4 billion bushels of soybeans, 15 billion bushels of corn in the United States, acreage going up on both of them, and we're also supposed to worry about a good crop in Brazil and Argentina. And that's what a farmer is supposed to run through their mind when they think about, well, when the hell should I sell my corn and soybeans? And am I going to make any money? Or maybe I might commit suicide because I'm going to lose the family farm. What the hell then? Okay, so there has to be a different system where we don't think that the rainforest is worth burning up to grow more corn and soybeans. Otherwise, we have more CAFOs, and I know a lot of people here are against CAFOs. And it's the reason that farmers can't afford to have livestock on their land. The animals in CAFOs aren't even owned by the farmers. So I want to get to where we can learn from the Roosevelt New Deal farm policy. We are talking about a Green New Deal, and that's not an accident. There's a connection to the old Real Deal in the terms that it changed the rules of our society. It changed the rules of our economy. Because of the New Deal, we have minimum wages, the Fair Labor Standards Act, Social Security, and there's a lot more if I could think of them right now. But what the farm program did under the New Deal, the very basic thing, the farm programs under the New Deal were a hodgepodge of a lot of things. So, you know, like any kind of legislation, it doesn't come out the way you want it. But the very basis thing of it was to set a floor under farm prices. That meant that whoever bought corn and soybeans was going to pay a price for it. It didn't mean that we were going to give subsidies to farmers, although that did happen. The most fundamental thing was that if you're going to buy corn and soybeans, or wheat or oats or livestock. You got to pay what it costs to produce it, or there's consequences. And so from 1941 to 1952, farmers got 100% of parity. That means the prices they got in 1941 adjusted upwards with inflation, so that in 1952, the purchasing power of what they produced was maintained. That's the definition of parity, just like a minimum wage. If it's increased with inflation, then it's a parity wage. And so we got to ask, it's very simple. What happens if we don't have parity prices? So here's an income, a farm income, and there's, let's say, 1 million farmers in it, and now inflation erodes those prices. That means the income is smaller. What has to happen? Well, some farmers are not going to be able to survive, and the other farmers are going to farm more land. And they're going to want to increase yields. So what do? They buy the technology, they plow up the pasture, whatever. For many years, they increased the supply of livestock, only to find out they didn't make any money raising livestock. And this has completely evolved to the point where the farmers don't own the livestock. All we do is raise corn and soybeans to feed somebody else's livestock. So we know now what would happen if farmers don't get parity. We're living that result. It's kind of like if you bought a toy, and every time you wound it up, it just went crazy in your house. And every year you'd wind it up again and it got worse. And you just ignore that. You somehow feel like you just got to wind that toy up every year. Well, you wouldn't do that, but that's what we're doing as far as agricultural policy, by not having farmers get parity. So now I want to talk about parity prices. Farmers right now are getting about $3.70 for corn and $8.40 for beans. And those are very close or below what either Iowa State or USDA says is really cost of production. But I want to emphasize, cost of production is not what's important. Fair prices for farmers. For the last 40 years, I and almost everybody I know has been fighting for fair prices for farmers. But that's not the issue. The issue is, what does Cargill and JBS and Tyson have to pay for that corn and soybeans, and what are they going to do with it? Because we know if it's cheap, well, they will just expand their CAFO operation. So today, the parity price of corn, meaning that it would have advanced with inflation since 1952, would be $13 a bushel. And soybeans would be over $30 a bushel. Now that seems outrageous. It is, but it's only because of inflation. These figures don't lie. We know what inflation is. We know how it affects everybody's lives. So it's calculated every day of the year by agencies within the U.S. government, and USDA calculates the parity index, which takes into account the costs that farmers have, their taxes, their insurance, and living expenses. So it's like a cost of living index, but it's directed at the farm economy. So instead of talking about fair prices for farmers, we need to focus on what is the cost of the feed that goes into those CAFOs, because they're not paying enough. And how would that change things? And we have to realize that there's a connection between the price level of commodities and the production system and the consumption system. It's about a misallocation of resources. That's a term I got from my modest economics training. If you have a misallocation of resources, sometime down the road, people are going to say, and maybe it's your children or maybe your grandchildren are going to say, what the hell are you doing? Look what we ended up with here. And you say, oh, well, it was because we just let consumers do their thing, buy whatever they want, and this is the result. Well, no. We have a responsibility for how we use our planet and whether the people that are on that soil have the ability to take care of that soil and have a community that supports their families. So, I could get into the details about how we set prices at parity, but I don't think we have time. But it happened in the New Deal from 1941 to 1952 with what was called the non-recourse loan. And I want to reiterate, it affected the prices. That means it affected what the purchaser had to pay for it. If we say that, the cost of production of corn is $4 a bushel and the market price is $3.50, so we'll give you a check for that extra 50 cents to get you up to the cost of production. We might even give you an extra 50 cents for doing things for the soil. No, that's not good enough, because that just leaves the CAFO system in place. And I don't think we could believe that having all the livestock in CAFOs is compatible with having a regenerative agriculture. So what we need is, obviously, parity prices for all the farmers around the world. The same economic rules apply to them too. That means that every country would have to have food sovereignty. So when they vote for somebody, the people that represent them in government can pass legislation that will actually assure they get a fair price. And it would, their agricultural system could be in accordance with their traditions, with their cultural traditions, and produce the food that they'd like to eat instead of those 50,000 damn things that are in a grocery store. So, like I said, it's not about fair prices for farmers. If we, here, okay, I'm jumping ahead here. Here we go. Okay, here's what we got with 25% of parity prices. We got crops and livestock really cheap. We got lots of crops being raised. We got lots of livestock being raised. And we got lots of meat, milk, and eggs coming out of industrial livestock operations. Now, this is what would happen if we had parity prices. So the price of corn was $13 a bushel and the price of soybeans was $30 a bushel. We would have to have a supply management system where we grew less corn and soybeans. There would be land that would be freed up from that could be returned to hay and pasture and part of a crop rotation for regenerating our soils. And the meat, milk, and eggs would be cheaper or more expensive, so we would consume fewer of those items. But they would be healthier items because they would be raised on pasture. At least the meat and milk. Anyway, I don't know about the eggs. People do raise chickens on pasture too. Okay, so that's where we need to go. Now, I ask you, if we have 25% of parity prices for farmers, is this scenario possible? Could we have fewer crops? Could we have fewer livestock? Could we have more expensive meat, milk, and eggs? No, that's impossible. So I don't care how many incentives you give farmers. Okay, I'm about ready to end this thing. You cannot give farmers enough incentives to change the agricultural system as long as farmers are getting 25% of parity and as long as Tyson and those big CAFO companies only have to pay 25% of parity. So anyway, let's see if I got anything else here. Oh yeah. So like I said, there's a direct connection between the price level that farmers get for their products and the production system. You want this on the left or do you want that on the right? And so, as I said about the dairy farmers, they were the champions of soil health. They had pasture and hay, and they rotated that, so they had manure, they didn't need a nitrogen fertilizer. Their weed control was easy, but they went out of business in droves in the last 10 years, and I don't know who was saying anything about it, but they should have been. So, here we go. What we need is a just transition. We can't just think about, oh, we're going to get this little piece of legislation and we're going to get Cindy Axley to pass this little piece and all that kind of stuff. No, we've been trying to do that for 40 years. That is not going to work. We have to change people's mind at how they look at society. So we need parity prices for everybody around the world, and it's through food sovereignty and international cooperation. And I think if we get people to think about how they want to live in a parity society, then not only will we have a real living wage, a parity living wage, not only will we have farmers on the land getting parity prices and animals out of CAFOs, but a lot of other things will fit in place, like reparations to African Americans and reparations to Native populations. So it all comes together, and that's the kind of society I want, and I hope you do too, a parity society. Thank you.